Shabbat Shalom again. So, there is a fashionable style of academic critique of the Torah. It began way back in the times of 1800s Germany, called Wissenschaft. And the idea behind this was that if you pay very, very careful attention and squint just right, that some passages in the Torah seem to focus on Adonai, and some passages seem to focus on Elohim. Other passages seem to have their own flavor altogether, and there's an admixture of focus from what might be considered a priestly obsession. And thus was born the J source, because Yud He Vav He in German begins with a J, the E source for Elohim, the D source for the Deuteronomical writings, and the P source for the priestly writings. It has kept academics in business for about 150 years as they retread all of the issues that we were discovering 2,000 years ago through our own analysis of Torah, but coming to far more radical and less helpful conclusions. But there was one thing that came out of this flurry of perpetual academic activity that caught my attention. Back in, I believe it was the 90s, a book was published called The Book of J. And the author purported to take all of the passages from the Torah that were part of this J source and to extract them to recreate the original J narrative that was then melded into the other narratives to make the Torah that we know and love. But what was fascinating about this attempt was that the author claimed that the book of J had been written by a woman. Now, all of them believed that humans were the authors of their different portions, but to say that more than 3,000 years ago somebody was sitting down and letting a woman write a book that would become a sacred text for a Near Eastern culture was quite radical. What was the proof that this section of the Torah was written by a woman, of all things? Well, it focused a lot on women issues, and the women were portrayed in quite a positive light. Now, that may be a little bit of a sliding scale. We certainly, as we talked about recently, can still see the distribution of economic authority handed over primarily to the men. But if you compare it to other ancient Near Eastern sources, you know what? It actually is fairly pro-woman in comparison. Women are not constantly being portrayed as sexual temptresses. They're not constantly being portrayed as mere adjuncts or extensions of their husband's identity. They are involved in the family affairs. Their voices are heard, albeit not quite as often as the men. But when they are heard, they're usually right. And when they are heard, they're usually on the winning side and get approval. Think of Abraham and Sarah and the decisions regarding Ishmael. God says, listen to Sarah. Think of Rivka and Yitzchak in our own Torah portion this week. Who wins at the end? Rebekah. And she was right. Jacob was the better son. Not that either of the two boys were perfect. When we get to Rachel and Leah, it is they who take things under their command, and it is Jacob that messes things up with the favoritism that he shows to his boys. And when we get to Moses, the main character of the entire Torah, how many men do we know in his life? 2, unless you count Pharaoh. We know his father is Amram, about whom we know nothing, and we know that his brother was Aaron, about whom we know that he was a mouthpiece for his brother and also messed up with the whole golden calf thing. How many women do we know in the life of Moses? Miriam, his sister, his mother Yocheved, who was instrumental in saving his life in the first place. You'll notice that the father is completely absent in the salvation of Moses. And likewise, the daughter of Pharaoh is intimately involved in saving him from the river. And we also have to go back to the Egyptian midwives, and we have to fast forward to his wife Zipporah. all of whom, in all of the incidents, except for one, when Miriam makes a little mistake later on, are given positive treatment throughout that section. And of all of the additional people who get named, technically, if you count all of the daughters of Zelophehad as individuals, they outnumber the number of positive other Israelites named, because we only have really Joshua and Caleb as being positive in the rest of the group. So maybe they was onto something. Maybe there was some focus here. Maybe, indeed, if we look at the issues that are involved, especially in Bereshit and Genesis, maybe that is predominantly women issues. After all, there is no more powerful and common trope throughout the book of Genesis and the activities of our ancestors than the issue of fertility. Fertility. This seems to be the main issue in all three of the generations of the patriarchs and matriarchs. With Abraham and Sarah, Sarah cannot conceive, and so what does she propose? Take my handmaid, take Hagar, have a child with her, and thus I will be built up through that. How well does that work out? No. And this is where we begin to see that perhaps there may not be entirely perfection throughout all of this. And we must begin to analyze the relationships between the husbands and wives in each of these generations and realize that perhaps the Torah is telling us something a little bit more important than just let's pay attention to so-called women issues. Because after all, what goes wrong with the taking of Hagar? I hear somebody whispering. Please speak up. I can't hear. I'm old. What goes wrong? She's jealous. It turns out that Sarah is not happy when Hagar actually conceives. Sarah, the one who said, take my handmaid, and if she conceives and gives birth, it'll be considered like my child. As soon as Hagar gets pregnant, Sarah gets very upset, and as soon as Hagar gives birth, Sarah's even more upset. It seems that this doesn't work out. Now, does that mean that Sarah was mistaken about her emotional state? Perhaps. It might also mean that Sarah was presenting an option to Abraham that he was supposed to reject. Has anyone ever been in a relationship where one member of the group says, I think we should do A or B, and really A is absolutely off limits. And if you are a sucker and take that option, boy, are you going to be in trouble. It was put on the table to make the illusion of choice, but you were never meant to take it. Indeed, I know of a synagogue that when they were trying to design the new building, they felt they had to give the congregation a choice, and so they had the architect draw up a totally unsuitable building, which the congregation then went ahead and voted for, rather than the one that they wanted them to. You never give a choice unless you are happy with the other person choosing that option. But perhaps Sarah felt cornered. Perhaps she felt that if she didn't do something, that he would reject her anyway. For we don't hear that Abraham was on her side during these crises of fertility. We don't hear that he was there supporting her during this time. We don't hear that she was supporting him during this time. But when we look at the next generation, when we look at Isaac and Rivkah, they too have an issue of fertility. And what is the solution at this point? No more handmaidens. It's one of the most beautiful passages. You really need to do your weekly reading. Isaac prays for her. Isaac prays for her. She says, I need to have children, and Isaac prays on her behalf. Now, does that mean her prayers were not enough? No, of course not. Of course, her prayers have the same weight before the throne of God as anyone else's. But what she hears by him praying is that he is on her side. He doesn't say, well, you know, my parents had this problem, and my mom had another solution. Let's just go find a nice, cute girl, and I'll get her pregnant, and everything will be fine. Isaac does not say that. Isaac does not take the bait of going for that option. Instead, he is patient and says, you know what? I am with you in this. If having a child is that important to you, then I will pray that we can have a child together. And it works. Now, Could he have also have mentioned that perhaps she didn't need to be so desperate and hurt by the thought of not having children? Could he have talked about other options, such as adoption? Yes, of course. And in the modern world, that would be another thing that would be important to include in the conversation. But the very act that he was willing to hear her pain, to listen to it, and to respond to it with prayer is quite earth-shattering as an example of our own relationships. To be attentive to another person who is crying out and saying, this causes me pain. To listen to it, and to even know sometimes there is no solution that you can provide, no way that you can fix the problem directly, but that you can stand with them in solidarity, with sympathy and empathy and compassion as they go through this, and together turn to the divine as that only source of a solution. And then we get to the next generation, Jacob and Rachel and Leah and Bilhah and Zilpah. Fertility issues, again, not on Leah's side. Leah seems to be very, very fecund. But what's the issue with Leah and Jacob? It's an issue of love and trust. Jacob feels betrayed that he was tricked into marrying Leah in the first place. And he sees himself as being the victim. Nowhere do we see him acknowledging, despite her plea after plea after plea, as she names each of her children in a desperate attempt to get his attention, to maybe show her some love. Nowhere do we see him respond by acknowledging that, you know what? She was also the victim of her father Lavan. She was also taken advantage of and put into this horrible situation where there was no good solution for her, where she would end up being married to a man who didn't want to be married to her and would look at her and resent her for the rest of their life as a symbol of having been cheated. But we don't see that from him, and we don't hear from her own expression of pain directly. It might have been a cultural norm of the time that the women were not allowed to express themselves, and certainly growing up in Lavan's household, that might have been what was expected. But hopefully in our own day, we recognize that if you have been that hurt, if you too are a victim, and you see another that is equally a victim of the situation, that you don't resent them for also sharing in the victimhood of this situation, but instead you draw together with them and say, you know what, you're right, Lavan was a jerk. He hurt you and he hurt me. But let's get even on him by actually having a good relationship. That would be the best revenge to give to Lavan. You try to saddle us with each other, you try to cheat us so that you can get more work out of this man, and try to get rid of this daughter that you don't want around. Fine, let's work together. We catch a glimpse of that when Leah and Rachel at the end of their sojourn with Lavan say, yeah, let's take the sheep and run. They seem to be a little bit more on the same page. But with Rachel, the beloved, beautiful Rachel, the darling, the one that captured Jacob's heart, when she is struggling to conceive, what is his answer? What am I, God? So you can't have kids? What are you coming to me for? The deafness of this man. But it's because for him, everything is fine. He's got plenty of kids. Leah is popping them out one after the other. What does he need more kids from Rachel? Right? He didn't marry her to have kids. He married her because she was attractive. He's got what he wants, and he cannot hear her cry. He cannot hear her problem, and he cannot even give her the same sympathy that his father gave to his mother when she was struggling to conceive. He can't even say a prayer on her behalf. It turns out that it's only when Rachel and Leah work together that Rachel is finally able to conceive. It is only a solution between the two of them that leads to a resolution of Rachel's grief and pain. So maybe this is a woman's book. Maybe in the end it is about failures of husbands to properly hear and address the issues, although Isaac is a little bit of an outlier. Maybe it is a book that was penned by a feminine author. I don't believe that it was a particular woman at a particular time. I don't believe in the whole book of J theory. But I also want to push back on the idea that we might assume that this was written by a more feminine author simply because it deals more considerately and sympathetically to women characters as well as women issues, by pointing out these are not women issues. These are issues. These are family issues. Honestly, do we believe that fertility is some uniquely woman issue? I don't know if you've ever been told, but it takes two to tango. And the children are considered to be children of both the father and the mother. It is not a uniquely woman's issue. The reproduction capabilities of each of these generations may be focused on the woman as the, in quote, barren one. But that does not mean that this is a woman-only issue. These are crises for the whole family. And the fact that many people continue to read these stories as being woman-focused, including the author of the so-called Book of J academic work, is part of the underlying issue. God is neither male nor female. God has no gender, and God wants us to recognize each other as, yes, each having our own identity, but in a relationship needing to recognize the issues that affect all of us and each of us, not because of our reproductive organs, but because of our shared humanity. And God does this beautifully throughout the Torah and the Tanakh. And if we think we can dissect the book into tiny little pieces to fit our own version of what we think it might be trying to show, it is not surprising that we come to such flawed conclusions. But this happens time and time again with topic after topic. People choose selectively the different passages that support their own preconceived conclusions. But when we recognize the holisticness of the Torah, the wholeness of the Torah, its ability to inform us not of men's issues and women's issues or Jewish issues or other issues, but only of the concerns that humans share, then we recognize the true divinity of the document. For only God could write such a thing that would be able to transcend the narrow interests of different people. And as such, as those people with narrow interests, we would be well advised to pay attention. Shabbat Shalom.